First of all, it's a real pleasure being here, and I am really so impressed by the size of the group today. This is my this is my third time, I think, speaking to the group. The first time I think there was maybe 100, next time 125. I don't know how many you are today. I heard over 200, and I see this as a sign that, boy, there may be a real paradigm shift starting to happen. So it's great being here. What I was asked to do today is a bit different. So I was asked not to present on anatomy of an epidemic and that information, but psychiatry's response to anatomy of an epidemic and what that may be revealing. So what I'll just explain what the theme of anatomy of an epidemic is, why it presents a challenge to mainstream psychiatry, and what their response has been. So anatomy of an epidemic has this framework. We understand the common wisdom, the common understanding in our society is that Thorazine arrives in asylum medicine in 1955. That kicks off this psychopharmacological revolution, this great advance in care. And then we get antipsychotics, we get antidepressants, anti-anxiety agents. Listen to the name, antipsychotics, as if these are fixing psychosis. Then starting in 1987, we get the first of the second generation drugs. That's the SSRIs. Then we get the atypical antipsychotics. This is that next step up this ladder of progress. We are told they fix chemical imbalances in the brain, etc. And this is the common wisdom really in society as a whole, is that we have antidotes to fix biological problems, and there's been this extraordinary progress. So as a first way to put that story of progress under a microscope, I just looked at how many people are under government care due to mental illness, and how has it changed as this revolution unfolded. And what you find when you do that, you find that when you go back to 1955, there were about 360,000 people with psychiatric diagnoses in state hospitals, which is where, at that time, quote, the disabled mentally ill were. You go to 1987, there were 1.2, we go through deinstitutionalization. By 1987, there were 1.25 million people on SSI and SSDI because they were said to be disabled by mental illness. And people say that may be comparing apples to oranges, and that's true. So what you really want to look at just in terms of a marker is from 1987 forward, and that number of people on disability has gone from 1.25 million to 4 million in 2007, which is when I was doing some of the research. It's now over 4.5 million, so there's been 500,000 people added to the rolls just since basically I was working on the book. So you can see that why it raises a question. Why is this revolution unfolded? Are we seeing this astonishing rise in the number of people on disability? Now, even since the book, one of the things I've done is look at disability rates in other countries, so I've been traveling around. Australia, the disability rate has, numbers have increased fourfold since 1990. New Zealand, fourfold. Iceland, 250%. You're seeing it everywhere in the last 20 years, where you get this embrace of psychiatric medications. So, looking at the disability numbers, disability data, I said it raises these questions. One, how do psychiatric medications shape long-term outcomes? How do they shape the long-term course of people diagnosed with schizophrenia? How do they shape the long-term course of people diagnosed with major depression, bipolar, etc.? And that's just going to be a scientific question. I'm going to try to chart what science tells us about how the course has changed over 50 years and how the medications shape that course. Anyway, when you do that, what you find with great consistency in the scientific literature over and over again is a story about medications that's, in short, goes like this. The medications may knock down target symptoms of the disorder better than placebo over the short term. Okay, and that's why they get approved by the FDA. Second, once you're on the medications, if you run trials where you withdraw half abruptly and you maintain the others on the drugs, those withdrawn abruptly do relapse at great rates. Okay? And those relapse studies are seen as the evidence base for why we keep people on their drugs long term. By the way, most of those studies are abrupt withdrawal. But then the other evidence on long-term data, and I'm not going to really go through that much here, is this. Time and time again, you see over the long term, medications increase the chronicity of the disorder, even on the target symptom. So you'll see people diagnosed, say, with the first psychotic break. If you follow that cohort or a first schizophrenia group, the group on medications actually end up having more sort of psychotic symptoms over the long term, more functional impairment, that sort of thing. Depression, the same thing. You'll see actually antidepressants appear to be depressogenic drugs over the long term. Benzodiazepine, same thing, et cetera, et cetera. So what you really see is an increase in, if you look at the long-term data, and this is why I think the book has gotten some attention. It's one of the first real efforts to look at how does this paradigm of care affect long-term outcomes and also functional outcomes, capacity to work, that sort of thing, cognitive abilities, et cetera. So that's what I reported there. And then the next question is, what's driving the disability numbers beyond, say, the increased chronicity? And here's the answer. This extraordinary explosion in bipolar patients. It's not actually psychotic disorders. Then you got to ask, where are all the bipolar patients coming from? Because it used to be the prevalence 40 years ago in the adult prevalence, annual prevalence was around 1 in 5,000. Today we're around 1 in 50. So it's a 100-fold prevalence, increase in prevalence. You track where people are coming from, and here's where they're coming from. Illicit drugs, that's one gateway. Stimulants, in other words, prescribed for ADHD, is another gateway. And antidepressants is the big one. Okay, you go on an antidepressant, there's a certain percentage that will have a manic or hypomanic episode. In response to that, they go into the bipolar diagnosis, and that's really driving the numbers. And if you follow that research, it means we have a paradigm of care that is sort of creating iatrogenically bipolar patients. Okay? Oh, sorry. So you can't hear me. Can you hear me now? All right. Can you hear me better now? All right, so you didn't hear any of what I just said. What a start. Okay. You should have spoken up earlier. What? Okay, good. All right, so you can see why this presents a challenge to mainstream biological psychiatry. Because it's saying that if we look at long-term outcomes, we're not helping people in the aggregate get better, stay well, et cetera. And in fact, we have this thing where in essence we're creating a group of patients who go on disability, okay? That part of our disability is sort of an iatrogenic epidemic. So that's the framework. Now what's the response of psychiatry to this? Now the obvious response, and I'm going to go through this, the obvious response is to say, here are the studies that show we're improving long-term outcomes, right? This is what Whitaker missed. That's the easy response, and we're going to see, have they pointed out any such studies? Because that's the obvious thing to do. One of the people who blurbed the book, this is from David Healy, and I think he summed up this challenge of psychiatry. David Healy is a well-known psychiatrist from Wales. He's actually Irish. He says, if psychiatry wants to retain its credibility with the public, it will now have to engage with the scientific argument at the core of this book. So the point of this is, anyway, the point of this is, we want to see, did they engage with the argument? That's really the purpose. And how did they engage? And what does that show about their defense of the mainstream story? Okay, and I'm going to have some slides in terms of a slide presentation that was done at MGH to repudiate the book, and we'll go that. The first thing that happened was this. The morning the book was released, a review appeared in the Boston Globe, written by a child sleep specialist at one of the Harvard-affiliated hospitals. Now, if you look at his department, it's heavily funded by pharmaceutical money. And here's what the review said. 1, Whitaker is a layman. 2, he thinks anecdote substitutes for evidence. Those of you who've read the book, you'll see that it's so filled with studies, you're bored to death. So, but he says he mistakes anecdotes for evidence. He's setting me up now as a layman, okay? This is not science. Then he compares me to an AIDS denier. He says nobody reasonable can possibly dispute the fact that psychiatric medications have helped millions of people live better lives. Just a flat statement. And then he likens me to a South African dictator by denying AIDS caused hundreds of thousands of deaths. So that's what I woke up to on the morning my book was published. Not exactly the launch party you're looking for. Before that appeared in the printed edition at like 6 in the morning, etc. Now the electronic edition comes out about 2 in the morning, and that person, Dennis Rosen, I think is his name, by the way, he had never written a review before for the Globe. Okay, this was a submitted review. It was up on Psychology Today's website by 3 in the morning. So it was also getting out there, et cetera, sort of saying. Now, I have to say, this was really well done. This really worked. Now, I don't know who did it. I was actually thinking of doing a lawsuit because you actually can slander people if it's completely false in a book review. And I wanted to do a lawsuit to do discovery to figure out who was behind this. But, you know, that takes money and time. I think it was clearly an orchestrated response. And one of the things you can even see is, it's not written by a psychiatrist, right? They got a child sleep specialist to do it. Why was it effective? I had all my radio interviews canceled. Okay, boom. Now, next, I had, this was my 4th book, okay? And all 3 books actually have gotten some sort of, in one fashion or another, some sort of notable book of the year distinction. So you'd think I'd get some book reviews. No newspaper touched it after this. No newspaper reviewed the book, okay? It just went. That was it. Silence set in. So you have to say that was really effective. Hats off. They did a good job. They painted me as, just, ridiculous. So what was the next thing happened? Well, thanks to sort of the peer movement, who I was asked to give a heads up to. This is actually true here. You know, fortunately, I did have some presence in this field, and especially among peers and all. And just by word of mouth, people began reading the book. There were a couple little things that happened. Time magazine had a little thing that sort of gave it, this is something worth reading. Bruce Levine, I don't know if you know that name. He's a good writer. He did something that really helped the book. He said, it's like the silent spring of psychiatry. That helped. He got that on Huffington Post. Oh, before I get into the peer thing, which really helped, Salon did an interview with me as well. This was about it in terms of the media. And it was really pretty favorable, the review. Within minutes after that review being posted, there were like 100 comments underneath that review or that interview from people saying, I love my drugs, they've saved my life. Who is this guy? Who is writing that? It's basically trolls. So basically, you have pharmaceutical companies, et cetera. They have people that will sit behind desks and pretend to be patients, et cetera. There's no way 100 patients came in within an hour and said how much they love their drugs and they've never had an adverse event, that sort of thing. It was so much that, was it Slate or Salon? I think it was Slate. I forget which one it was, actually. They shut off the comments because they were just coming in so much, so heavily. The point is, there is a PR machinery out there that will go after you. That's really the point of this. The peers sort of saved me. They got me invited to they have an annual conference. It's called the Alternatives Conference. It's a big conference, 1,300 people. It's funded by SAMHSA. They got me invited to be the keynote speaker, which makes a little bit of visibility. Then I got disinvited as the keynote speaker. And obviously people complained to SAMHSA, okay? I don't know if it was drug companies. I don't know if it was people in the NIMH. I don't know who complained, but I was disinvited. And then actually the peer group did a call-in campaign, and they began calling the White House and calling SAMHSA. I heard one great story. I don't know if it's just true or not, but I'll tell this story. I heard one person called up, and I think it's to the White House, and the person says, I want to make a complaint. And they were complaining about being disinvited, and the person answering the phone goes, let me guess. It's about Whitaker being disinvited. So the power of the peer movement. Anyway, they got me re-invited, and now the re-invitation came with a caveat. The caveat was that I would give a talk, and then a psychiatrist would follow to say that what you just heard was nonsense. And we're sorry we invited this guy, but you know, the peers. Anyway, there would be a rebuttal, and I would not be allowed to respond to the rebuttal. Okay, that there would be a rebuttal, etc. Not the usual keynote invitation, but that was this one. And here's what I think happened. So they gave the rebuttal to a guy named Dr. Mark Reagans, and Dr. Reagans, from what I understand, I'm not 100% sure about this, is my understanding. He went to one of the local psychiatric departments at a medical school, I think it was UCLA, I'm not positive, and said, you tell me where Whitaker's wrong, and where's our evidence that we improve long-term outcomes? And I believe I was leaked the response to him, and here it was. Unfortunately, they said, we've checked out, we've gone back to the source documents, et cetera, we've checked it all out, and here was the bottom line. Unfortunately, he is very accurate. So if you were there, what happened was, this was a chance to rebut me in a scientific way, because I went through the literature. I did a thing on first episode psychosis, antipsychotics. It was all about literature, NIMH-funded studies. And the rebuttal was a thing about how friendship helps. And I'm literally sitting in the audience going, am I against friendship? I didn't know I was... Anyway, interesting thing. So here was a chance for a rebuttal on a national stage. No studies were cited, okay? No one came forward and said, here's our evidence we're improving long-term outcomes, or here's our evidence that we're not creating bipolar patients, okay? That's really the key here. All right, next thing was, just going through, and I'll get to MGH real quickly here. I then was invited to go, psychiatrists in Maine began reading this book, in mass, like a book club. And they invited me then to come up and speak to their book club. And I arrived one day. I'd been on a red eye. The red eye didn't leave at night. It left like 4 in the morning. So I get in Boston about 1 o'clock. I drive up to Portland at 6 o'clock for this meeting, and there's like 20 psychiatrists sitting around. I swear to God. They put me at the end of the table. I almost need my hands, but let's see if I can do this. I sit down, and one psychiatrist goes, it's time to take the gloves off. And I thought, Jesus, I'm tired. Holy Christ. So anyway, so he starts listing studies. And they're all short-term, okay? And there were like drug withdrawal studies or pharma-funded 6-week studies, that sort of thing. Or maybe some extension studies that go about a year, that sort of thing. But they're all pharma-funded. And finally, it's about 20 minutes, one of the older guys in the group says, but these are all short-term studies. He's talking about long-term. And the guy goes, oh. And then something really interesting happened. The older guy said this. He said, I remember I was at, I think, McLean's in 1970s, and I remember in McLean's we weren't medicating psychotic patients regularly, especially the rich ones, they said. The poor people we were putting on meds. We're saying, okay, take your meds, etc. And what we saw was those we worked with got better, and those we put on meds did not long-term. So next thing you know, I'm in this club where a guy's saying he's right, which was good. Then what happened is that club actually sent out a notice to the listserv, to American Psychiatric Association listserv. Maybe there's something here. Maybe we should really look at this and respond, etc. So that was good. So what I'm saying is it began to bubble up is what happened. It had sort of legs. If you look at what was going on in sometimes blogs, some journal reviews were beginning to appear in defense of mainstream psychiatry, here's what you'd say. They'd say, I mistake correlation for causation. In other words, I was saying that the disability data proved that the drugs don't work. Actually, if you read the book, I say the disability data raises a question and doesn't prove that. It just raises a question. We're going to have to go to the science to see how the medications shape long-term outcomes. Second would be that I cherry-picked the data. I mean, in other words, I was just looking for studies that showed harm, and I was leaving out the studies that showed benefit. Well, there's a real easy way to show that someone's cherry-picking the data. You show what they didn't include. But when that complaint never included what I didn't include. And then it was, he's anti-psychiatry, et cetera, so that sort of thing. And there was never, interestingly, any denial that antidepressants were increasing bipolar rates. It was just not sort of discussed, that part of it.